Anyone who has an even passing interest in the Near Eastern Bronze Age will have heard the name Ugarit or Ugarit. The city and the trove of documents found there are essential for piecing together the sequence of events that led to the Bronze Age collapse. But what about the city itself? What do we know of the history of the city and its people? What happened to this once thriving and prosperous port? Let's dig in. The modern site of Ras Shamra, the ruins of ancient Ugarit, sits just inland from the coast of northern Syria. It's a relatively low-lying hill and only about 800 meters from an excellent harbor location. Around it is a fertile plain that extends northward to the foot of Mount Zafon, is bounded to the east by the Alawi mountain range, which itself tapers toward the coast near the Nahr es-Sin, a river which frequently demarcated the southern border of Ugarit from its southern neighbor, Siyanu. The territory around Ugarit was in many ways prime real estate, and so it's no surprise the remains of the site go back to the Neolithic period, or the 8th millennium. By 7000 BC, the site had a substantial agricultural settlement, though it declined in significance during the Chalcolithic period. This may be related to the arrival of new ethnicities at the site which disrupted the existing Neolithic settlement. This new period exhibits similarities to the Halaf culture, which is known from northern Mesopotamia. In the 4th millennium, a period where the Ubaid culture thrived in Mesopotamia, settlement continued at Ugarit and copper use is first attested at the site. By 3000 BC, in the early Bronze Age, the settlement was first truly urban. Walls and densely packed urban construction appear, and mud brick construction gives way to more stone construction, and copper and bronze manufacturing increases. Evidence of trade is seen, particularly with ceramics, with Cilicia, inland Syria, and northern Palestine. Ugarit was in contact with the kingdom of Ebla, one of the great powers of the early Bronze Age. Records at Ebla mention a city, Ugaraat, which some take to refer to Ugarit, though this is disputed as it is not clear what the early Bronze Age city was called. It may have been called Ugarit, but it may have had a different name entirely. It's not clear because by 2200, the early Bronze Age city at the site was abandoned, marking a distinction between the early Bronze Age city and the later Middle and Late Bronze Age city. Now this corresponds with other episodes of abandonment and collapse around the Near East. The end of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the decline of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, and the destruction of the First Kingdom of Ebla. Ugarit is not mentioned in the sources of its neighbors between 2200 and 2000 BC. The Sumerian Renaissance of the 3rd dynasty of Ur makes no reference to the city, which, paired with archaeological evidence, suggests it was abandoned during this period. The 3rd dynasty of Ur itself was destroyed by the arrival of a new group of people who would shake up the entire Near East, especially at Ugarit. Around 2000 BC, Syria, Mesopotamia, and even Egypt saw the rise of multiple Amorite polities. It's not entirely clear where the Amorite homeland was, though what is now central Syria seems most likely. These nomadic tribes moved throughout the Near East and established new polities with new ruling dynasties, including at Ugarit. In many ways, this is the beginning of the city of Ugarit. The city we know that was named Ugarit goes back to this Amorite foundation. But Ugarit maintains no records of its own during this period, what is called the Middle Bronze Age. It does appear in the records of its neighbors, though, and between the records of its neighbors and the archaeology of the site, we can sketch out the rough contours of the history of Middle Bronze Age Ugarit. Other Amorite kingdoms were either established or flourished during this period, which were dominant over Syria. The 3 major Syrian powers were the kingdom of Yamhad, based at Halab, modern Aleppo, the 3rd Mariot kingdom at Mari, and the kingdom of Katna. All were Amorite kingdoms from at least the 19th century. Ugarit was ostensibly incorporated into the kingdom of Yamhad and likely shared a border with Katna. Further, it's not clear how Ugarit was administered at this time. If a governor or some kind of administrator from one of the dominant polities ruled, or if a local dynasty of kings ruled, even if that king was only nominally or even functionally not independent. The Ugaritic kings of the later Bronze Age, it seems, trace their heritage back to this period, but it's not clear if this ancestry goes back to a king, a noble family, or a governor who became a king. The Amorite inhabitants of Ugarit are associated archaeologically with a number of distinct material markers, such as the wearing of torques or circular metal necklaces. And originally some structures at the site were dated to early in this period, but these have largely been downdated to either the end of the Middle Bronze Age or the beginning of the Late Bronze Age. Excavations have revealed a large amount of Egyptian artifacts, particularly 12th dynasty artifacts, including statuary with the names of 12th dynasty pharaohs on them. Some have suggested Ugarit was subject to Egypt in the 20th and 19th centuries, but this probably stretches the evidence, as some of these Egyptian artifacts were intentionally mutilated, suggesting they may have been looted from their original context and arrived in Ugarit as an early form of antiquities trade or as loot from the Amorite Hyksos dynasties of Egypt. Additionally, there are friendly references to Ugarit from the contemporary Amorite kingdoms of Yamhad and Mari. And while Ugarit does not feature much within the history of either Yamhad or Mari, it does appear in one particular episode where Zimri-Lim, the king of Mari and son-in-law of the king of Yamhad, visited Ugarit. Dozens of letters were written while en route, and so our knowledge of the itinerary is unusually detailed. This journey was significant for multiple reasons. At a pragmatic level, to the Syrian kings, Ugarit represented a wealthy port and key for accessing commercial ties with Egypt and to the west. At an ideological level, marching to the sea was an important ritual act which symbolically represented the king as the regent of the storm god, overcoming the sea and the forces of disorder. And Ugarit was an ideal place to make this symbolically charged pilgrimage. The Syrian kings stayed at Ugarit for a while, but if they recorded much of the city, we no longer have access to it. There is no mention of the king or even what commercial goods Ugarit specifically was trafficking in. Ugarit was simply the locale where various commercial transactions with foreign delegations, which are recorded, took place. While letters between Halab and Mari, dating to later in the life of Zimri-Lim, note the man of Ugarit, likely the king, wanted to visit Mari, it's unclear if this ever happened. Ugarit, it seems, was an important city in the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, but certainly not on par with major centers like Halab or Mari. In the latter half of the 17th century, Syria underwent significant geopolitical changes. Mari was taken by the Amorite Old Babylonian king Hammurabi, and Yamhad began to decline in power and its vassals asserted independence. In northern Syria and southern Anatolia, Hurrian speakers began to coalesce into a formidable coalition, and most notably in the second half of the 17th century, the old king Hattushili I all but destroyed the kingdom of Yamhad, despite not conquering Halab itself. This was accomplished by his successor and grandson Mursili, who not only destroyed Halab, but marched on Babylon and sacked the city in the early 16th century. And during all of this, Ugarit goes unmentioned, and there might be a reason for that. Archaeologically, it appears the city went into a decline in the mid-17th century until the end of the century. It was not entirely abandoned, as some of the important infrastructure remained in use, and only around 1600 did it again become an important urban center. During the 16th and 15th centuries, Ugarit was apparently independent. In Syria, Yamhad saw a brief resurgence, but was eclipsed by the kingdom of Mitanni. The Hittites retreated from Syria for a time, and Egypt was dominated by the Hyksos dynasties in Lower Egypt. Ugarit was apparently largely uninvolved in the wider international intrigues of the latter part of the Middle Bronze Age. It was never fully brought into the Mitannian Confederation, and its more Amorite character continued despite its decline. In the latter half of the 15th century, the 18th dynasty in Egypt expanded into the Levant, but make no mention of localities west of the Alawite Mountains. In fact, Egypt and Mitanni seem to have settled on the Orontes River as a more or less permanent boundary between the two empires, with Ugarit technically on the southern side of the river and so within the orbit of Egypt. This situation persisted until the re-entrance of the Hittites into Syrian politics early in the 14th century. With a delicate détente between Mitanni and Egypt, the Hittites were careful to only show aggression toward Mitannian areas of influence without direct aggression toward Egypt. This did not stop overtures from both the Hittites and Mitanni toward the commercially minded and functionally independent Ugarit, though. But should Ugarit side with either the Hittites or Mitanni, it would surely upset the other side, and Ugarit would face reprisals should it choose poorly. So faced with an impossible choice, the king of Ugarit made a third choice: to formally swear fealty to Egypt. From the 14th century to the end of the 13th century, Ugarit and its history are available to us in a way it simply isn't for other periods. This is in part because excavations have found large amounts of tablets, all kinds of documents from economic, diplomatic correspondences, letters, to mythic and religious texts. With these texts, we are able to reconstruct much of Ugarit's political history, as well as to understand important aspects of Ugaritic culture. These tablets are written in an alphabetic cuneiform script, which is apparently unique to Ugarit, aptly called Ugaritic. This language is part of the Northwest Semitic group of languages, with the closest linguistic link being Amorite, with languages like Canaanite and its dialects being a bit more distantly related. The texts we have from Ugarit date to sometime after around 1360 BC. This seems to be because a fire in the royal palace occurred sometime around that time, and in the repair, any existing records were discarded. The records we currently have date to the time after this repair, until the destruction of the city around 1200, giving us approximately 150 years of well-documented history from the end of the Late Bronze Age. It is from these records, as well as records from El Amarna in Egypt, that we know Ugarit came to be a subject of Egypt. This is apparent in a letter from the first firmly datable king of Ugarit, Ammitamru, where he pledges fealty to the pharaoh, either Akhenaten or his father Amenhotep III. He makes reference to a threat to Ugarit, but the letter is fragmentary and do not know to which enemy he is referring. It may be in reference to aggression from Abdi-Ashirta from Ammitamru, but this is not likely. Instead, Hittite sources refer to a campaign by Tutalia near Mount Safon on the northern border of Ugarit's territory, which may be a better fit. In another letter, a Babylonian king references Ugarit in relation to diplomatic marriages. If the letter is meant to be taken literally, then there is a chance an Ugaritic princess was married as a diplomatic marriage during the reign of Amenhotep III. Egyptian artifacts at Ugarit from this period may be taken as evidence of those close ties between the two royal houses. This changes under Ammitamru's successor, Niqmadu, called Niqmadu II by modern historians on the presumption that the seal from the Middle Bronze Age, which refers to a Niqmadu, is the first king of Ugarit named Niqmadu. It's not known when Niqmadu assumed the throne, but given the extant texts, we know he was a contemporary of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. Ugarit maintained its relationship with Egypt, and there is an Amarna letter wherein the king of Ugarit requests a physician from the pharaoh. Some have suggested this would be an inappropriate ask for a vassal to request from his liege, which may point to Ugarit being within Egypt's sphere of influence, but not really a vassal, perhaps only nominally aligned with Egypt. What may be most likely is that Ugarit continued to prosper as a commercial trading center, and Egypt likely didn't want to hammer out the details of the relationship too harshly, lest Ugarit alter their deal and close their ports. Basically, the money was too good for the pharaohs to insist on the observation of proper protocols. This generally amicable situation lasted until the mid-14th century, when Ugarit signed two separate treaties. The order of the treaties is debated. What was most likely the first treaty was signed with the new kingdom of Ammitamru. The kingdom of Ammitamru just south of Ugarit was formed by Abdi-Ashirta, a warlord who recruited Apiru warriors and forged a fledgling kingdom for himself at the expense of the pharaohs. Ammitamru had angered Egypt and all of Egypt's Canaanite vassals, particularly Ribhada of Byblos. By becoming independent of Egypt, his land was suddenly a target of both the Hittites and Mitanni. So he, and his son and successor Aziru, needed a peace treaty. He appealed to the Hittites to become a Hittite vassal, and then turned north to Ugarit to settle a treaty between the two polities. The treaty is in form a treaty between equal parties, but the stipulations favor Ammitamru. Ugarit pays a large sum of silver, and in return, Ammitamru renounces claims on Ugarit's vassals' territory. This kind of mob tactic, pay up and we won't hurt you, was kind of par for the course with Ammitamru. Shortly thereafter, around 1340 BC, Ugarit signed a treaty with Shuppilyuma I, one of the greatest of all Hittite kings. Shuppilyuma sent a letter to Niqmadu II and asked his help in attacking rebellious vassals, Nukhashe, Mukish, and Nia, and promised assistance to Ugarit in return. From this point, Ugarit becomes a loyal Hittite vassal. But this was not without costs. A letter found at Ugarit, called the General's Letter, written in Akkadian, not Ugaritic, asks for reinforcements to guard a pass in Ammitamru. The context for this letter is hotly debated, but during the reign of Akhenaten is most likely based on linguistic analysis of the text. Suggestions include that Ugarit was anticipating an Egyptian military response to them joining with the Hittites. Or maybe Ugarit was anticipating a military invasion from the anti-Hittite coalition they found themselves suddenly opposing. A possible reference to this is made in an Amarna letter. This letter is from the king of Tyre to the pharaoh and is a report on current events. He notes that a fire struck the palace of Ugarit and that half of it is destroyed, but no Hittite soldiers were present. The palace of Ugarit was renowned, and the very same king of Tyre was noting the largesse of his own palace by comparing it to that of Ugarit. So its destruction, even half of it, was noteworthy. But how to understand the lines in the letter is debated. Natural disasters like earthquakes may be culprits of fire in the ancient world, but the reference to Hittite soldiers suggests simultaneously that the Hittites were decidedly not responsible for the destruction, but that the destruction was not natural. Instead, some other source for the fire is to be sought. A plausible reconstruction is that this letter dates to the time of the so-called First Syrian War of Shupiliuma. This war saw the subjugation not only Mitanni, but the majority of its vassal states in Syria. It's possible that while Shupiliuma fought Mitanni across the Euphrates, some polities like Mukish, Nuhashi, or Nia raided deep into Ugarit, even burning the palace, and that there were no Hittite soldiers there to defend Ugarit. Shupiliuma did rescue Ugarit, and the city emerged otherwise unscathed from the First Syrian War. Records of the treaty signed between Ugarit and the Hittites show that Ugarit owed large sums in tribute, though no military assistance is stipulated, and their border with Mukish is clearly delineated with a list of 42 toponyms. Shupiliuma campaigned again later in his reign, taking Carchemish and thus finishing his conquest of Syria. Carchemish became a major Hittite center, with the leader of Carchemish acting as viceroy in Syria for the great king of the Hittites. Niqmati was succeeded first by his son Arhalba, who ruled only 2 years, contemporary with the 7th through 9th years of the Hittite king Mershili II. He is referenced in only a few short legal texts at Ugarit, in one of which he warns his brother not to marry his wife after he passes. And this may suggest he knew his end was near. Perhaps he was ill and died from some kind of health-related problem. But many historians believed he sided with a pro-Egyptian revolt with other Hittite vassals, and he was deposed by the Hittite king. Support for this theory comes from a treaty between Mershili II and Arhalba's brother Niqmepa. This is all speculation, as the actual circumstances in which Arhalba died and Niqmepa assumed the throne are not known at all. We do have the record of a treaty between Niqmepa and Mershili, which again confirms the northern border between Ugarit and Mukish, but also removed Ugarit's client state, Siyanu, from Ugaritic suzerainty to the king of Carchemish, again, who was the viceroy of the Hittites in Syria. While this decision was made, it took a long time for it to be settled on the ground. Border skirmishes and land disputes between Ugarit and Siyanu continued throughout the 13th century. Why the Hittite king did this isn't known. It could be because the kings of Ugarit only gave a half-hearted response in Hittite efforts to suppress rebellious vassals. This was not just a hit to Ugarit's prestige, but the treaties with the Hittites and Ammitamru both required substantial amounts of tribute, and they now had even less territory from which to pull in order to fulfill those obligations. As the Hittites were partitioning their vassals in Syria, the Syrian states worked to ally with one another. Niqmepa allied with Ammitamru by marrying an Amorite princess. This princess, and best-known queen of Ugarit, was named Ahatmilku. She likely arrived in Ugarit while still a young girl, around 1314 BC, when she was betrothed to the king of Ugarit. She had a long and storied career as queen and queen mother. In fact, she lived so long, some scholars think there may have been 2 Ahatmilkus, as if there was only one. She must have been in her 90s when she died. And this brought Ugarit and Ammitamru into closer relations, with Ammitamru again playing the dominant role. Ugarit was wealthy and commercially minded, while Ammitamru was a rougher land whose primary export was mercenaries and trouble. Early in the 13th century, the 18th dynasty in Egypt ended. The young King Tutankhamun died, and a new dynasty took over shortly thereafter. Along with that came a re-evaluation of Egyptian non-aggression in Syria. And this culminates in the famous Battle of Kadesh, which led to the Hittites consolidating their control over Syria. The polities of Ammitamru and Kadesh, being at the border, suffered greatly during these wars, while Ugarit remained largely unscathed. The Hittites and Egyptians eventually settled a peace treaty, which brought further prosperity to Ugarit. It sat on the intersection between all the great powers and mediated trade between all of them. And this proved incredibly lucrative for Ugarit. It was the port of entry for Egyptian grain that was so desperately needed by the Hittites, and Ugarit then played a vital role in the sustenance and maintenance of the Hittite Empire. This is evident in the many legal cases Ugarit brought to the king of the Hittites, wherein the great king almost always sided with the king of Ugarit. As other Hittite vassals in Syria were stripped of autonomy in favor of favored kingdoms like Carchemish, Ugarit was again left unscathed during the 13th century. Ugarit was largely left to its own devices. Ugaritic elites didn't adopt Hittite cultural customs, and Hittite texts were largely absent. Despite centuries of vassal status, Ugarit remained culturally distinct from their overlords, something we don't see in places like Ammurapi. But Ugarit was not without troubles in the 13th century. Several lawsuits from neighboring kingdoms and from Ugarit itself indicate that highways and roads were not altogether safe. Merchants were often murdered and their goods stolen. Hostages were taken and ransom was demanded. Foreign kings wanted access to Ugarit's markets, where they could get dyed wools, fine garments, bronze goods, oils, and other fine wares, but they lamented the lawless situation that Ugarit was either unable or unwilling to fix. Most of the troublemakers were semi-nomadic tribal groups or the socially unsettled like the Sutians and Apiru. It is apparent that as Ugarit's commercial capabilities increased, its militaristic capabilities declined during the 13th century. And dynastic issues were a problem as well. Ammitamru II was the son and successor of Niqmepa, but this came only after significant dispute. There were 3 brothers who claimed the throne. Instead of one killing the other, Ahatmilku, the wife of Niqmepa and future queen mother, negotiated the exile of 2 of the brothers, her sons, with Ammitamru taking the throne. The brothers left to Alashia, modern-day Cyprus, but Ammitamru continued to have issues. As his father had done, Ammitamru married an Amorite princess. The marriage was not to last and ended in divorce, of which the fallout is discussed in 15 separate documents between various political figures from the time. The reason for the divorce is not stated, but both adultery and palace intrigue are possibilities. The princess returned to Ammitamru with her dowry, but left all her belongings in Ugarit. But Ammitamru was still not pleased and demanded the return of the princess so justice could be served. Her brother, the king of Ammitamru, knew this would mean sending her to her death, and so he refused. The 2 kingdoms were on the brink of war when the Hittite king had to intervene between his vassals. He negotiated the return of the princess, but for a price of 1,400 shekels of gold. Ammitamru could have his revenge, but he would have to pay handsomely for it. Ammitamru was succeeded by Ibiranu, who was succeeded by his son Niqmadu III in turn. These kings continued the commercial enterprises of the kingdom, and the territory was largely static. But letters from the Levantine coast make reference to the many misadventures of Ugaritic merchants. In one case, Ugaritic sailors offended the storm god of Sidon. The Sidonians demanded their heads, as well as their impalement. But the king of Sidon felt some luxury goods from the king of Ugarit would assuage the divine wrath just fine. Beirut embroiled itself in the continued border disputes with Siyanu. Ugaritic merchants and Tyre owed substantial debts that went unpaid and required several letters be sent to ensure collections. And the Tyrians complained about the high tolls they owed at Ugarit. The king of Carchemish had instructed Ugarit not to venture much further down the coast than Tyre, but there is evidence of Ugaritic contact with merchants from Akko, Ashdod, and Ashkelon. Ugarit had friendly relations with Alashia, as evidenced not only by the textual evidence recording the trade between them, but the high volume of Cypriot ceramics at Ugarit and even a whole oxide ingot at Ras ibn Hani, an important town in Ugarit's territory. There is no strong evidence of commercial ties with the Aegean, which may be related to Ugarit's status as a loyal vassal of the Hittites, who had their own geopolitical differences with the Mycenaean world. The Hittite world grew increasingly fragile, and with it Ugarit's position in the world. During the reign of Ibranu, the Hittites went to war with the rising threat of Assyria. The Syrian king Shalmaneser and his son Tukulti-Ninurta waged war against the Hittites and sent letters to Hittite vassals, including Ugarit and Ammitamru, 2 of them to the side of Assyria. Instead of forcing the issue, the Assyrians campaigned against Babylon, sparing the vassals from picking sides. Under Niqmadu III, relations between Ugarit and the Hittites, including their representative at Carchemish, continued to deteriorate. Niqmadu is chided by the queen of the Hittites for not sending adequate tribute. The king of Carchemish sends a similar letter, and given the economic prosperity of the city, this cannot be due to an inability to pay. The Hittites were clearly on the decline, and polities like Assyria were on the rise. Ugarit was left to navigate a path forward in an increasingly uncertain world, with new challenges and unexpected threats on the horizon. The final king of Ugarit was Ammurapi, who took over after his father died. The final years of Ugarit are some of the best documented in the entire history of the kingdom. From the texts, it is apparent that the decline of the late Bronze Age world was well underway. The collapse was not entirely sudden, nor entirely complete. As a quick aside, it's during Ammurapi's reign that much of the textual evidence we associate with Ugarit was produced. Undoubtedly, the most important textual source is the famed Baal Cycle, the epic poem detailing the mythic history of the city's patron deity. The iteration we have of this story preserved from Ugarit was composed during Ammurapi's reign. One of the leading experts on Ugaritic studies has suggested that the Baal Cycle was composed so as to coincide with the rebuilding of Baal's temple at the city. He even suggests a tsunami may have destroyed the earlier temple around 1250 BC, something likely attributed to the sea god Yam, which necessitated a rebuilding of the temple. And so when the new temple was rededicated, the Baal Cycle and a stela depicting elements from the story were dedicated with the temple in or around 1210 BC. Now, much more can be said about the Baal Cycle, its interpretation and importance in modern scholarship, but we'll have to wait for another time. But the Baal Cycle is thankfully not our only source about the cultural and political world of Ugarit during the reign of Ammurapi. Letters continue to show that Ugarit's relationship with its overlord further deteriorated. The Hittite king reminds Ammurapi that he is a vassal and owes specific obligations, including the transfer of large quantities of grain, as there was a famine in Anatolia. Letters between Merneptah and Ammurapi suggest Ugarit was courting a new overlord and was contemplating a switch of allegiance. The Hittite world was in dynastic turmoil, and Ugarit had historical connections with the pharaohs. Ugarit was apparently looking to expand against other Hittite vassals. The king of Carchemish reprimanded Ammurapi for sending only poor quality soldiers and keeping his best chariot warriors at home. And further, he was accused of camping his army in the far north in the land of Mukish, an attempt to capture territory belonging to their neighbor. Nothing came of the Egyptian overtures, or at least it didn't develop into anything. Ugarit experienced its own troubles. The Hittites had a history of famine and needed grain shipments mediated through Ugarit. But Ugarit itself had food shortages at the end of the 13th century, despite fielding some of the largest navies in the Bronze Age capable of transporting large amounts of grain. Whether the navy was primarily commercial or militaristic is not clear, or whether such a distinction is even relevant for the late Bronze Age. And despite the naval capabilities of Ugarit, it was increasingly subject to raids and attacks from seaborne threats. The so-called Sea Peoples have long been blamed for these attacks on Ugarit, and rightfully so. Letters exchanged between the king of Ugarit and the king of Al-Ashia describe 7 ships causing havoc. 7 ships here may be typological and not literal, though if the territory was undefended, 7 ships may have been enough to cause significant harm. The king of Ugarit states that his armory was in Hatti with the king of the Hittites, and his fleet was in Lucca, that is southwestern Anatolia, and so his homeland was undefended. Given the reprimands the king of Ugarit had for failing to provide adequate military support, we might doubt the king's claims. References to Shikala people correspond with the Sikala or Shekelesh mentioned by Ramses III as part of the Sea Peoples Coalition. And the king of Ugarit seems had good reason to keep his soldiers at home and to seek military intelligence from Al-Ashia. We don't have a blow-by-blow of the end of Ugarit. We're left to piece it together as best we can. One suggestion that seems plausible is that a land force disembarked on the northern shores of Ugarit, and this is why Ugarit was keeping its best soldiers at home on the border with Mukish. Ugarit apparently lost a battle, as personal correspondences from citizens of Ugarit reference it being unsure how severe the loss was. As the enemy marched on Ugarit, no help would come. The king of Carchemish tells Ammurapi, "Surround your cities with walls, bring your infantry and chariotry into them, be on the lookout for the enemy, and make yourself very strong." Translation, you're on your own. Ugarit had failed to send their military to aid both the Hittites and Carchemish, and in their final hour, it was reciprocated. The final attack came sometime between 1190 and 1185. A large destruction layer was excavated at the site. Originally attributed to fires after an earthquake, this is no longer accepted. Arrowheads among the debris suggest fighting throughout the city at the bitter end. But the lack of bodies suggests many evacuated the city before the final assault. Many buried their wealth, indicating both foreknowledge of the attack and an intention to return after the danger had passed. And some people did return, but as squatters. The majority did not return. The victors no doubt looted a lot of the city, but to our benefit, they also missed a lot. Why so few returned is not clear. The destruction may have been so complete it simply wasn't worth returning, or a large portion may have been caught outside the city walls and killed, so there simply wasn't a lot of people left to return. It just isn't known at this point. During the Iron Age, small communities lived at the site, but nothing on the same scale as the Late Bronze Age city. Based on the Iron Age material remains, we can say it was populated by a mixture of newcomers and ancestors of Bronze Age Ugaritians. The countryside seems to have avoided the worst of the destruction, as toponyms of sites continued from the Bronze Age well into the Iron Age and beyond. But after 1185, Ugarit as a city forever ceased to exist.